Name of the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudate to Jesus Christus. I hope everybody's doing very well. This is Timothy S. Flanders, meaning of Catholic. I'm joined today by my friend and brother, Erick Ybarra. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Tim, for having me on.
Excellent. It's a joy to continue the conversation. Erick is a Catholic writer, apologist, blogger, erickybarra.org. He is co-host with Michael Lofton at Reason and Theology. You've got all the links at the show notes. And Erick has come on the show today to talk about the Greek Schism Part 2, the Rise of Constantinople. So we're going to be talking about that today. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to mention we're going to pray for one of our patrons' children who have left the faith. And I'm sure there's many children, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, parents who have left the faith. So we'll offer up our Father at the end of this show for their sake, for their souls, especially for the parents, continuing in prayer for their children. So today is the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. And so it's a very fitting topic to talk about the papacy and its relationship with the Greek East and the rise of Constantinople. And so last week we talked about one of the causal factors, which I identified as a cultural shift from a multilingual Roman Empire to very isolated Latin West and Greek East as one causal factor. Erick, what are some other general causal factors that you can identify briefly as to the different causes of this schism?
Yeah, wow. There's so many to speak from. Certainly the ones you mentioned. Also, there was a difference in canonical collections. When you go back into the Latin West in the 4th century, going into the 5th century, we don't really have a definitive collection of canon law. The popes refer to the canons, and most of the time they're referring to Nicaea and Sardica. Towards the end of the 5th century, at the opening of the 6th century, you have St. Dionysius Exiguus, who is probably the father of Latin West canon law. He composes a collection of canons. And then in the East, you have a patriarch of Constantinople in the latter part of the 6th century, John Scholasticus. And he creates a collection of canons, and they're notably different. And especially with regard to the apostolic canons. In the Latin West, Dionysius, his collection, which began to be known as Dionysiana, did not contain all of the apostolic canons that were handed down. They're probably a creation of the 4th century, but scholars, the best of scholars, know that it does come from material that predates that. Whereas John Scholasticus puts the full 82 or 87 apostolic canons in there. So the East and West, that's going to explain some of the divergences as they meet heads in later centuries. You have a difference in the understanding of the basic ecclesiological government. Everybody kind of knew that there was a primatial government of the church, a hierarchy of the church. The East tended to adopt fully the logic of what Father Francis Dvornik called the political accommodation, which was when Christianity was emancipated from the dark times of persecution just before 313 AD. Constantine, the emperor, who became a Christian, sort of incorporated the old ancient Greek Hellenistic idea of king and religion. And so he took on this role as a basically almost like a king priest who was divinely appointed to assist the church. And you can't mistake this, because you've got Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century writing a panegyric of Constantine, and how he basically was adorned in purple at the Council of Nicaea, sitting at the front center. It's terribly difficult to not see that with the revolution of the church in the 4th century, the church began to adopt the geopolitical format and organization of the church in order to be a sort of the glove for the hand for church government. So you start to see the development of metropolitans, synodal governments that mirror the senatorial procedure in the Roman Senate. You start to see the minute by minute of the acts of councils mimicking that of what you would see in the at the head of the Senate in Rome. And so Rome tended to have adopted that, but they also kept it subservient to what's called the Apostolic Principle, that Father Francis Dvornik is famous for calling it, where the heads of the church, you could say, are those who have a episcopal signature going back to the apostles, principally speaking to St. Peter in Rome. And for the East, this tends to be accepted in word, and I'm sure there's many Eastern saints that intersected fully with the Roman conception. But what we do end up seeing, especially for those Easterners who broke communion with Rome, which happened many times, and it happened for decades at a time here and there, they tended to understand that there was a divine, almost like a divine revelation in the 4th century with this incorporation of church and state. And so that becomes not just an embodying principle, but almost a divine signature of how the church is supposed to be. And so you can't have a council without an emperor. You can't put the decrees of councils into law without an emperor. It gets to the point where you can't have the Patriarch of Constantinople or the Patriarch of Rome elected without the emperor's basic, approval. So this, we see this really floating atop at the late 4th century at the Council of Constantinople 381 in the 3rd canon. So if you want me to discuss that, I can.
Well, let me pause first, because I want to cover a little bit the pre-Nicene era, and that's kind of the I named this show The Rise of Constantinople because that is the historical, and that's a historical assertion, because every historian will agree that there was a rise of Constantinople and its bishop, but it's also a causal assertion to say that is one of the main causal factors as well, with the rise of Constantinople and its bishop. And as I discussed last week, that was one of the strong points of animosity with the other Easterners, mainly the Coptic Orthodox and also the Assyrians, who were alienated or felt alienated for whether that's their fault or not. They felt very alienated from the Roman experience as Roman citizens. But I wanted to ask you first, before we even get into the Constantinian era, Nicaea, and afterwards, Newman makes the claim in Development of Doctrine that the papal evidence before Nicaea is more than the real presence of Christ. Fortescue makes the claim that there are more papal statements before Nicaea than there are quality Trinitarian doctrine. He says there's more difficulties you'll finding Trinitarian heresy, so-called, obviously. We're not going to impute that to the pre-Nicene fathers, but you have more difficulties with their Trinitarian language than with their papal language. So would you agree with those assertions? Why or why not?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would agree with that. I know what you're talking about. That's one of my favorite books, is St. John Henry Newman's essay on the development of doctrine. I remember distinctly going through that. That's in the beginning portion of the book. And I just remember being compelled by it when I did read it. I would probably qualify, I guess, because it depends on what St. John Henry Newman meant by the papacy, of course, because all the way up until the 15th, 16th century, and some would argue the 19th century, there was still a debate over some of the finer implicit logic that comes with the papacy on whether he could be infallible without the consensus of the church or without the consent of the church. That might be, something that's a much finer tributary offshoot from the main river. So that may not count as, it's not a late belief, of course, but it is a development of doctrine. If you were to ask me if every Christian in the 4th century believed that the Pope could speak infallibly, I would say you probably have many voices affirming it. You'd probably have more voices than affirming that would question it. And then you'd probably have some that would just flat out deny it. So I want to be historically careful to that. But if we're going to speak comparatively, which I think is what St. John Henry Newman is trying to get at, when we're talking comparatively with the evidence that exists for the full-fleshed teaching on transubstantiation, or the full teaching on the singularity and the duality of Christ's divinity and humanity, his two wills, his two operations. I guess we could, there is a truth to what Newman is getting at, and it's definitely a noteworthy observation.
Yeah, I think he was just asserting that they're not being fair with the evidence. They're saying,
right,
well, we're going to completely accept the Nicaea II with all its iconography that developed at this time, which was not present and even challenged in the earlier periods. But we're going to completely disregard any evidence of these popes before Nicaea at all. So if there's any difficulties, they're not being fair and saying, well, okay, all of these doctrines have their difficulties in different ways, all the different orthodoxies. I mean, you can find these different examples in different areas to a greater or lesser degree, but we need to be fair. So what can we say fairly of the claims of the papacy be pre-Nicea?
Yeah. So, what we have pre-Nicea, which, first of all, we need to kind of pause and stand in amazement that we have anything. The fact that we have pre-Nicene literature to look at is quite an amazement to begin with. Obviously we have the New Testament, which is clear about the primacy of Peter. At least, the leader of the apostles, even in the Coptic, Syriac, and Byzantine liturgies, you have references to Peter as the head leader, the Korypheus of the apostles. Following the New Testament, you have early writings. You have one instance, there's a dispute in the Church of Corinth over the leadership being replaced. And it's the Greek in the first opening chapter is difficult to say whether Clement, the Bishop of Rome, heard about the situation and took it upon himself to write to Corinth, or there's an indication later on where they sought Rome's opinion, or they sought Rome's judgment on the matter. I go with the latter. I think that the Church of Corinth appealed to Rome, which is quite a distance. And I think that by itself, it doesn't really scream, Vatican I. But when you put that on the shelf with the other pre-Nicene evidence, especially with some of the post-Nicene evidence, it gets, you could say it gets kind of like a Catholic credit, because we see that the early habits of appealing to Rome were based on this ancient idea that Rome had certain sacred rights to govern the church. Of course, Clement doesn't say, from which constitution the right is based on, but we do have an action of Rome in a foreign church and with an issue of discipline, with a strong exhortation to obedience. Following Clement, you have the situation in North Africa. There was a dispute over which penitents were going to be allowed to return to the Holy Cup and the sacred body of Christ. It had been popular to deny people who had committed adultery in the post-baptismal state from ever coming back to communion. And so we have evidence from a North African presbyter, Tertullian. He was a priest and lawyer before that. And we have evidence in Tertullian that the Bishop of Rome wrote what he calls an edict, which, if you're living in Rome at that time, that is a legal script that you mean business when the emperor or some sort of magistrate is writing something for a certain municipal or a province. And Tertullian in North Africa talks about this edict that's coming from the Pontifex Maximus, which Tertullian meant derogatory. He meant it as a derogatory term, but that only serves to better evidence that the Pope of Rome was he felt responsible to act authoritatively in a foreign church. There's no case in the world that you're going to argue that by 180, 190 that North Africa is part of the Metropolitan Patriarch of the West. That's just way before we get the concept of Patriarch of the West. And yet we still have the Bishop of Rome writing to North African churches about this. And we find out that the Bishop of Rome was right about the edict. That became the norm. Of course, you did have a schism later with the Donatists, but that they broke away from what was becoming the norm before them. So you have Tertullian, and this is Pope Callistus writing that edict, and this is going to be year 217, between 217 and 222. After that, you have actually before that, you have a situation on the uniformity of the celebration of Easter, and what we gather from the account that we get in Eusebius of Caesarea and his ecclesiastical history, as well as in Sozomen, the Greek historian from the 5th century, is that this question, which today may not vex Americans especially, but back then it was a huge deal, and it's quite amazing because in the early 2nd century, it wasn't too big of a deal for Polycarp and Pope Anacletus to commune with each other while they diverged on the date of Easter. But as we get into the late 2nd century, 175, 180, not just Rome, but many of the other churches like Alexandria and Jerusalem are concerned about the divergence in the date of Easter, in particular with those who calculated the date of Easter to be on the 14th day of Nisan, which was the Jewish Passover. And we have evidence that the Bishop of Rome is the initiator of councils being called all over Gaul and as far as Asia Minor.
That's modern France, by the way. Gaul.
Yeah, Gaul is modern France. That's correct. So you have the Bishop of Rome calling these regional synods together, and we know that because in Ephesus, actually it was in Asia, not particularly in Ephesus. Yeah, it was in Ephesus. Saint Polycrates, he was the bishop of Ephesus, and because he was the metropolitan of that province, he was the head of the council of the Asiatic bishops. And in his letter to Victor, he says, we assembled the council as you requested. So that, again, it doesn't scream Vatican I, but what it shows is that there's a habit, there's an action that's, it doesn't have to be explained. It's just something that occurs, which shows that Rome is kind of responsible in far out regions on matters of discipline. Now, some of the Orthodox and the Protestants, and especially some of the anti-papalist Anglicans in the late 19th, early 20th century, pointed out that the Church of Asia refused to obey Pope Victor, who finally came down hard on the date of Easter being the Sunday after immediate, the 14th day of Nisan. And when Pope Victor found out that the Asiatic Synod was not going to conform, Pope Victor, we're told by Eusebius, enacted he used the sword of excommunication, and he sought to excommunicate them from the common union of the church, which is special language, because it was known then that every bishop has a right to sort of excommunicate another bishop. And every bishop at that time felt they had the right to withhold the chalice in their church from a particular bishop or bishops, or even a whole town of bishops, which meant that those people were banished from the cup or the chalice in his church, right? But what Victor is doing is a public affair. It's a public excommunication where the Asiatic churches are not to be registered in the church anymore, anywhere. And so that's the difference in excommunication, the nature of that.
Yeah, that's like the modern schism between Moscow and Constantinople is understood by many Orthodox to be sort of an internal schism within one church, which they kind of excommunicated each other, but they don't really, either of them are arguing about who has the authority to ban the other from sort of the whole church. But you're asserting here that Victor is asserting this authority to ban someone from the whole church, as opposed to just his church. I want to get into Nicaea and the 7 ecumenical councils. We want to try to get all the way to the Council of Florence tonight if we can.
No
God
problem.
willing. We'll see. So I wanted to ask, so we have Soloviev asserts that every ecumenical council was a triumph for the papacy, which I don't see that in number 2 or number 5. But maybe I'm wrong. But so I want to ask you, is that the case, or to what degree is that the case? Second question is the other trajectory of the 7 ecumenical councils, so we're talking year 325 to year 787, the first 7 ecumenical councils. The other trajectory is the dispute over the taxus of the sees, which begins at Nicaea. Like you said, there's a Petrine taxus, which is Rome is first, the Petrine See, and then what is it, Alexandria is second, or Antioch? I can't remember. Alexandria. So Alexandria is number 2, and Antioch is number 3, and it's all because they're Petrine in some way, and that's at Nicaea. Whereas the next ecumenical council, which is a very Greek council called by the Greeks by themselves to a degree, and they changed that in that council and that's where the rise of Constantinople comes in. So what can you say, if we can just kind of touch on some of the notable ecumenical councils, maybe not all, to what degree was it a triumph for the papacy? To what degree was the rise of Constantinople happening?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a very difficult question because even the Greeks, the Latins and the Greeks, by the 7th century, they were already revising history on what constituted ecumenical councils and how they happened. For example, at the Council of Constantinople 681, in the second or third session, I believe, the bishops sort of go into like a panegyric of the older councils. And when they get to Nicaea, they say that Pope Sylvester called the council with Emperor Constantine. And when it came to Constantinople I, they said that Pope Damasus collaborated with Emperor Theodosius, which to any historian today is bogus, So the Greeks themselves, the Latins themselves over time they became so convinced that the Pope of Rome was necessary for a council that they just assumed that all the councils had the Pope convening it and the Emperor convening it together.
So for the viewers, let me just clarify so Council of Constantinople is the 6th Ecumenical Council. That's number 6, year 681. So they're referring back to these papal callings of the council, even though that's historically dubious.
Yeah. When I say historically dubious, we just don't have a lot of record on how Nicaea got started. We do have the outbreak in Alexandria with Arius, and we do have a local synod that turned into an ecumenical synod, but it really was called by Constantine. Osius of Cordoba is the one who led. He was the leading bishop. He in turn turns out he's working under the auspices of the Pope. But I wouldn't say that it's clear from the documentary evidence that Nicaea was a victory for the papacy. What I would say is that Nicaea started off as a bright star, and it became a waning candle within 10, 15 years. And if it wasn't for the papacy in those post-Nicene years, it's quite possible that Nicaea would not have had a leg to stand on. It came about with Pope Damasus and Peter of Alexandria, the Bishop of Alexandria, both of them, but principally Pope Damasus, who really enforced the Council of Nicaea and came to the aid of certain giants in the East, like Gregory, like Basil, and Meletius of Antioch, and some of the Easterners who were trying to really hoist the flag for Nicaea. It was terribly difficult to do so in the East. But for Rome came down with the hammer each and every time. Granted, there was a lapse in Pope Liberius, but this was a man who was taken out of his freedom. He was taken out of his liberty. And when he regained his freedom in Rome, he was sharp as an axe on Nicaea. And so Nicaea really gets Catholic papal credit in the post-convening years, because it really was destined for the trash bin. So we have Constantinople I, which was called without the participation of the Pope, from what we know. But at that point in time, it was a regional council. So it really wasn't, materially speaking, an ecumenical council, even by the modern day Greek Orthodox standards. It was Eastern Regional Council called by the emperor. So you had the emperor and you had an invitation, but it really was not, you didn't have the West, and Alexander wasn't there for each session. So that council is really a regional council. It's got great importance, but Rome never accepted those decrees, even as late as the 6th century. Pope Gregory, actually going into the 7th century, 601, says that Rome only accepted the creed of Constantinople I, not its canons. Now that's debatable, but so those first two councils are really imperial events, I would say. It's the church really testing the waters of the new imperial structure. So I want to say it's around the 5th century with the Council of Ephesus, 431, where the papacy starts to say, okay, I'm going to put my gloves on and get into the ring, and I'll play game with these councils. Before that, you don't really see Rome investing so much. Rome invests a lot in Nicaea because it was her baby. It became the cornerstone, of canonical legislation, and so did Sardica. But at Council 431 is where you really start to see the Pope sending official legates with instructions, orders, and decrees, and the papal legates require a first place on the signatures The papal legates are required to oversee the decrees, object to anything that goes contrary to what the Pope said. So Council of Ephesus, you see that quite blatantly, especially with the Philip the legate, really spoke about how the leadership of the church is rooted in Peter. The Bishop of Rome is his successor. Christ gave him the keys, and so the successor of Peter can bind and loose in the universal church, and it's by his ratification that the councils rest on. That's where you start to see Rome playing ball with the imperial structure.
So one point to make here is that the claims of the papacy, especially by 431, namely that all those things you just mentioned, cannot be unknown to the East.
That's impossible because, before the Council of 431, Cyril of Alexandria is the one who sort of, he threw his binoculars on over what was going on all the way in Constantinople with Nestorius. Nestorius was preaching homilies, and he was, the line was getting thin. And eventually he finally said, okay, no. Mary is not the mother of God. So Cyril of Alexandria put his binoculars down and, got his camp gear and started to get his weapons out and started writing to Constantinople. But eventually he wrote to Rome, and Rome turned around and said, here's an official excommunication with an ultimatum of 10 days. If he doesn't recant within that time, he is banished from the entire church, from the blood and body of Christ, and from the priesthood itself. And Cyril carries that letter to Constantinople through some envoys. So we already see Alexandria, Cyril of Alexandria totally cooperating with this intervention of the Pope all the way over in Constantinople. So yeah, by Ephesus 431, and especially by Ephesus 450, Chalcedon 451, we definitely start to see these councils turning into, some sort of a shining trophy for the papal authority.
So, and what about the rise of Constantinople during this period of the first four councils?
Yeah, so the Byzantines floated a canon in Constantinople 381, the council, which said that because Byzantium, the old Greek city, became the new capital of the empire, that privileges of jurisdiction, or at that time it was called privileges of honor, but it meant ecclesial privileges. The same ecclesial privileges that were given to, Rome, because Rome was the capital of the empire, should now apply to Constantinople, the new city, because it is the capital of the empire. So you see the Byzantines here, what they're doing is they're taking the mechanic of the geopolitical model of ecclesial organization, and they're just applying it to the new situation. And so they did not get papal approval for that canon, which ended up being a problem because in the Council of Chalcedon, they felt the need to renew that canon because it really didn't have universal approval before, especially from Alexandria. Alexandria certainly wasn't a fan of Canon 3 because, you have Cyril of Alexandria against Nestorius, and then you've got Dioscorus against Flavian. And then, Alexandria was certainly not on board with Canon 3. So at the 28th canon of Chalcedon is where they try to really put steroids into that old canon so that they can get it floating above water.
And before this time, the papacy, as well as Alexandria and other sees, were trying to defend Nicaea, the Nicene Taxis, which was based on apostolic. So we have two different primacies at work here. We've got the apostolic primacy asserted by Rome, which says that these three sees are head of order: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch. and then we have, not to mention Jerusalem, and then we have the imperial model of order, which is asserting, well, because it's the imperial capital, it should have second place or even equal place to old Rome, because, well, that's old Rome. That's no longer really the capital. So you have these two dynamics happening. So that continues to go in. So what is the 28th canon of Chalcedon?
Yeah, so the 28th canon of Chalcedon, they obviously thought that Canon 3 of Constantinople 1 needed to be renewed. And not only renewed, but they insisted on the reason for its legitimacy being that the fathers gave primacy to old Rome, elder Rome, because it was the seat of the Senate. You know, it was the seat of the sovereign. And then it insisted on certain privileges in the three territories nearby, Thrace. The other two are not coming to mind, but certainly there was Eastern territories that it wanted metropolitical rights to. So that was the 28th canon. And, it's difficult to know exactly what they were thinking, because the Petrine primacy of Rome was not denied at all in the council. The council was quite aware of the Petrine primacy. In fact, when the bishops of Chalcedon wrote their, once this council dissolved, they wrote their post-conciliar letter to the Pope. They mention how he is the primate of the Universal Church on the basis of this inheritance of St. Peter. So it's very difficult to see what they were thinking. I think Father Francis Dvornik has made the best headway with understanding this, and that is that in the original constitution of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, there was a socio-political principle at work, but if it probably was during the apostolic era. And we see this because the apostles are addressing letters to metropolitan cities. So whenever they created a mother church to be sort of like a missionary center, they went to the greatest city of that arena. So it's quite possible that Peter chose Rome because that was going to be the best center for a mother mission in the West. And it's very possible that Peter sent Mark, his disciple, St. Mark, to Alexandria because of the preeminence of Alexandria in the socio-political mechanic. So it's quite possible that the apostles were working off of that grid. But the thing is, it was their prerogative to make a deposit on those cities. It's not for the church in later centuries to start taking the same logic and establishing new deposits of primacy. And so this is where this difficulty comes in.
Yeah, I mean, by that logic, Moscow should be the head of the church a long time ago. I mean,
yeah,
Moscow had the preeminence for 500 years, but
yeah.
there's also the idea of St. Andrew founding Byzantium. But I wanted to get back to that 28th canon because I wanted to read what St. Leo says about that canon. He says, quote, "The agreements of the bishops, which are contrary to the holy canons of Nicaea, we declare null and void, and by the authority of blessed Apostle Peter, we annul them completely by a general decree," end quote. So that was St. Leo's response to that canon.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Emperor Marcion at the time and the Patriarch of Constantinople, Anatolius, they both submitted to that letter. They in fact, Emperor Marcion replied to that letter, congratulating Leo for not wanting the canons to be disturbed. So here you have the emperor of the emperor of the Roman Empire, who at that time is not a lay opinion. When Emperor Marcion, when he bows to Leo's decision, his the veto annulment on that canon, that is super significant. And when the Patriarch of Constantinople, who at this time, Rome doesn't even see it as a patriarch, but for all intents, for the sake of making it easy, we call it now Patriarch of Constantinople. For him to submit to it as well is significant. And Alexandria, Dioscorus certainly didn't submit to the 20th canon. So at the time of Chalcedon, you've got Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, and the emperor both giving a thumbs down. All of them are giving a thumbs down to this 20th canon. And this is one of the reasons why, like I was saying, John Scholasticus, who's the father, well, I don't want to say father, it was an earlier collection, but he's really known as it's called 50 titles. His collection of 50 titles, canon law, only counts 27 canons of Chalcedon. And even Patriarch Methodius, Saint Methodius, he carried over the 27 count even into the 9th century. So 28 canon gets in with, especially with the Council of Trullo, and with the adjustments to canon law under Photius. And even before that, you get the Nomo canon of 14 titles. The East starts to embrace this 28th canon, and
let me see if we can wrap up the 7 ecumenical councils there's a lot we can't get into, like the Cacan Schism, Hormisdas, but there does seem to be a resurgence of Constantinople. It just seems to continue to rise, especially with Justinian. He goes and he reconquests Italy. He deposes the Pope, installs his own Pope. All this. We've got Vigilius forced. And then later on, we have Pope St. Martin is forced by the Imperials to try to submit him to the Imperial decrees. And during this sort of second period of the Second Ecumenical Councils, the political loyalty of Rome to Constantinople is very much weakened because there's far more heresy and force used towards Rome. So Rome starts to seek protection with the Franks and begins to seek political allies, specifically starting with St. Gregory the Great, which is a very radical move on his part. So would you agree with kind of this shift? There is sort of a continued rise. Of course, we have the Mohammedan invasions, which cripple the empire in the East. But there's a continued rise in efforts in Constantinople for asserting this 20th canon at the same time as imposing certain heresies on the West. And then there's also this cleavage in the political loyalty. How do you see the second period, briefly, of that 7 ecumenical council period?
Yeah, it's almost immediate, because Anatolia seems to deny the validity of the Canon 28, but the affairs of Constantinople don't change. The Patriarch of Constantinople in the East meets some unexpected circumstances. In particular, the Egyptian and Syriac rejection of Chalcedon. That was not in the recipe. So Alexandria, Antioch, Syria, Palestine, you really get a devolution in orthodoxy, and it's really tough for the emperors to get the Energizer battery of orthodoxy back into gear, especially in Alexandria. And so Constantinople almost feels obliged to take up this leadership role, even if it's not really cognizant of the validity of that canon. But we know this because the bishops of Constantinople continued to write to Rome, asking Rome to ratify the canon, because Constantinople sort of needed this extra beef, this extra muscle in the East. But yes, you are right. When Constantinople itself went into heresy, it started to assert this near equality with Rome. That, or some sort of primacy that could, reject the authority of the papal see. And we get that because in the writings of Gelasius, Felix III, we get this complaining from Rome that the East doesn't feel obliged to obey the decrees of Rome. And so certainly running in the minds of many patriarchs of Constantinople that this idea of her primacy is running wild. And but whenever Constantinople reunites with Rome, the terms on paper are always with the proper adjustment. Rome is in the first place. Rome's succession from Peter is the ground of her primacy, and sign the dotted line. Thank you. And those are the terms on paper. Now, what actually happens? That's what makes Byzantine history so fun.
Yes, indeed. So let's wrap up. So we got 787 and later 843. The Triumph of Orthodoxy, which is celebrated on the first Sunday of Lent for all Eastern Christians, Byzantine Catholics included. So that whole controversy is wrapped up, and we have icons now. Now later, a layman is appointed Bishop of Constantinople by the name of Photius. So then we have the Faux-Tina Schism, which in my mind, I don't know if you would agree, but I think this is a major turning point, because the Soloviev, which I agree with, I think his analysis is spot on when he says that basically there were always these two different parties in Rome. There was the party of the heretics, two different parties in the East. There were the party of the heretics, and then there were the party of what he calls the quote unquote Orthodox, who are basically just all these other bishops who were somewhat envious of Rome and they want more power, and but they sort of go along with whoever's in power. They're either with the heretics when they're in power, or with Rome when he's Orthodox. And he says that after the seventh Ecumenical Council, there is sort of a standard of orthodoxy, and there's not really a serious heresy that arises in the East after that time. And so the Orthodox party in the East can then sort of gain control and then assert their orthodoxy against Rome as a way of that gaining that power. So, and I see that in Photius. So tell me what you think about that, and can you take us through some of the high points and low points of the Faux-Tina Schism?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's definitely, that's definitely true. Soloviev is great, very easy read too. I would say that in Constantinople at this time, they're still staggering from two different waves of iconoclasm. The first one gets piped down with the Council of Nicaea II, but nobody really takes that council seriously after that. And you, especially with the new, you get Emperor Constantine the Sixth. He's on board with Nicaea II, but then you get Leo the Isaurian, and he's definitely not an icon-loving man. And so you have this, resurgence of iconoclasm in the East. When he dies, his wife Theodora takes the regency of her young son Michael III. Michael III is too young. So Theodora is a lover of icons. And so in 842, she called a synod, and they sort of just, reasserted the decrees of Nicaea II. The Eastern Orthodox are very happy about this. They celebrate this to this very day. And I want to say January.
First Sunday of Lent.
First Sunday, yeah. So as Orthodoxy Sunday, 842. But following this, you have a split in the clergy and the Studite monks in Constantinople, and Theodora chooses Ignatius, who himself is a monk. He's of royal blood. He's the son of the previous Michael I, Emperor Michael I. Ignatius to the patriarchal throne of Constantinople, and he's a moderate. But no, he's not a moderate. He's zealous for icons. But the problem is, Ignatius is not well liked by many people in Constantinople, especially the moderates, who were, they accepted the rule of icons, but they were, they had a moderate policy. They sort of saw the Studite monk mentality as annoying, and this all took a turn with several events accumulating, but it took a turn with Emperor Michael III and his uncle Bardas, who was acting like the Caesar at the time, with Michael III. Uncle Bardas, who was a married man, eventually began to fall in love with his daughter-in-law, and this becomes talk in Constantinople. And one day he goes to receive communion, and Ignatius of the Patriarch Saint Ignatius refuses him the sacrament. So this causes a problem. Ignatius is already a pester on a number of accounts, and so Emperor Michael basically replaced Ignatius with the scholar, and he was a well-learned man, professor, but a layman, Photius, who in the span of 5 days goes from lector, subdeacon, priest, and then patriarch in 5 days. And he's the patriarch now in Constantinople. And so, long story short, they write a letter to Rome announcing the new situation. And Pope Nicholas reads over how Ignatius just so happened to willfully resign, and Photius was the perfect candidate and was ordained from the lay state to the patriarch in 5 days. Now, Pope Nicholas, this goes back to that whole issue of Dionysiana versus John Scholasticus, because Pope Nicholas had a canonical collection that included the 10th canon of Sardica, which forbade lay people to be an appointed bishop. And so, Nicholas sends envoys to the east, Pope Nicholas, St. Nicholas, and basically orders a reopening of the case of Ignatius versus Photius. Now, that's immediate jurisdiction. That for Rome to order the retrial, to order a reexamination of something that Constantinople herself, decided, and the case was closed for the East. For Nicholas to reopen it, he obviously appealed to the Petrine investment.
And I just want to insert a very important historical detail that we have not mentioned, and that's the filioque that starts to come up here. And the context of this is that Photius, when initially in 861, he wrote a letter that was conciliatory towards Roman customs, because something that we need to very much understand is that the tirade against the filioque was in context a tirade also against shaved clergy, celibate clergy, fasting on Saturdays, unleavened bread, and all these other things that were going on in the West. And so initially Photius says those things are fine. They're just customs. We think they're wrong because we've got different canons or whatever. He says this in 861. And then later when the Pope, and we'll get into this, but when the Pope goes against him, then he says that they are enemies of Christ. They're against the apostolic canons. And oh, wait, they also added to the creed. And that becomes a huge sticking point for him later on. And we don't have time to go into this whole thing, but I think the what you pointed out about the canons is very much the case with the East and West in terms of the Imperial Creed, because in 451, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed became the Imperial Creed. That was the identity of a Roman citizen in the East, was that creed. Whereas in the West, they had 3 different creeds. There was not the same sense of a strong Roman imperial identity with that creed. And as you've pointed out as well, Leo III tried to keep a balance by ratifying the Imperial Creed, but then permitting, or he tried to stop it, but he allowed the Filioque theologically. So there's these diverging practices, both customs and doctrinal terminology, that comes to a head at this point. So I wanted to insert that real quick. So St. Nicholas sends his legates over to Photius. Photius receives them. What happens next?
Yeah. So, well, at the council, Ignatius was, announced deposed, and that was because Photius, and he had many supporters in the East. You had two parties. You had the Ignatian party, and you had the Photinist party. Photius had the greater hand at this time and convinced the papal legates that all was kosher. Everything was fine. So they went back and told the Pope that, no, everything's fine. Patriarch Photius is all right. Ignatius is out. But during this time, Nicholas gets more information on what's going on. And eventually he comes strong down on Patriarch Photius being illegitimate. And basically writes a letter to the East addressed to the emperor and to Photius, saying that Ignatius is the lawful patriarch, Photius is not. And in the meantime, you've got a squirrely situation going on in the Balkans with the Bulgarian mission that seems to be converging with Greek missionaries and Latin missionaries and Frankish missionaries. And the Pope really wanted the missionary oversight of that territory back, since most scholars agree that Leo the Isaurian took those territories away as a result of the Pope not cooperating with his iconoclastic policy. And so the popes were all the way back to Hadrian at Nicaea II, Nicholas I in 858. He's still insistent on getting these territories back, and in particular the mission that's opening up with King Boris. He's the king over there of the Bulgars, and so that the Photius and the emperor respond negatively. They basically reject what Pope Nicholas is saying, and a funny thing happens. The missionaries in the Balkans are from the Latin side. They're saying the creed with the Filioque. They're eating cheese and drinking milk during Lent. They're fasting on Saturdays. They're doing all this stuff. And so Photius writes a famous encyclical in 867, which condemns Pope Nicholas, condemns the Latin missionary practice in the Balkans, which is all these differences that the Trullan canons would show, different liturgical practices, and in particular the chief problem was the Filioque. And so that's 867, and that really closed down the Pope. The Pope then responded with one of the most famous documents in all of papal history, claiming universal jurisdiction in both East and West, claiming that it's grounded on the divine investment by Jesus Christ in Peter and stationed in the Roman episcopate. Pope Nicholas was saying that Constantinople shouldn't even be considered number two. Its primacy is entirely political, entirely post-apostolic, and Pope Nicholas basically excommunicates Photius, and so this really closes down the relations between East and West at this point. I think all of the material for the Greek and Latin schism are there. But when you have a new emperor, things can get done. So Emperor Michael III is assassinated by his successor Basil, the Macedonian. And Emperor, the new Emperor Basil, he agrees with Pope Nicholas. He's reading all these letters from Nicholas. He's saying, no, we're going to clean house here. Photius, you are out. Ignatius, you're back in. We're going to follow policy that Rome says in the Balkans. We're going to do everything right. Now, of course, he had political interests. I don't think he was really, fighting for the papacy. But basically, Basil sends a letter to Rome saying, "Hey, we want to fix things according to your rules." And so Pope Nicholas gets a synod, the direction for a synod ready. It really falls to his successor, Hadrian. And Nicholas passes away. Hadrian II comes into power and into the papal chair. And then he convenes a synod in Rome, and he sends instructions to have a council in Constantinople, 869. This is 869. And, at this council, Photius is condemned. You have the formula of Hormisdas is put down on paper for the Greeks. And in addition to Acacius and all the other names, they put Photius. So the formula of Hormisdas was basically a standard libellus, basically of returning into communion with Rome. And but the East went along with this, but you start to see some resistance to this at the council. So much so that the papal legates, when they were going back home, their ship was I want to say, if I remember correctly, they were intersected by some Byzantines, and they had the acta of the council taken away. If it wasn't for Anastasius, I can't ever get his name right, Bibliothekaros Carus, the librarian. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have the acts of that council. So that council is completed, but it doesn't really cause the unity that Basil the emperor thought it would. And the majority of the clergy in Constantinople are supporting Photius. So there's a huge turn of events that happen in Constantinople, and Father Francis Dvornik is one of the he's probably responsible for bringing a lot of fresh material to the notice of scholarship on what really happened, because Catholics always used to think that Photius was, entirely schismatic all the way to the end. But it turns out that a situation changed. Photius and Ignatius reconcile, and Ignatius sort of agrees that Photius should be the patriarch on his deathbed. And so Photius takes up the chair of Constantinople, and Basil, the emperor, writes to Rome and says, "Hey, look, this is the new situation, and we want it rectified. What can we do?" And Pope Hadrian II, it fell to John VIII actually, because Hadrian II passed. So John VIII then agreed to another council in Constantinople to be held in 879. At that council, Photius is restored. His condemnation is annulled. Glaring statements of papal power from St. Peter and Christ are left in the Acts, both Latin and in the Greek. So that council is a reunion council. I want to say it's a successful one. Photius agrees. Photius is considered back into communion with the church. And, unfortunately, Photius fell under he fell into disgrace again with the next emperor. I want to say Leo IV. And he's banished from Constantinople. So things get all roary again in Constantinople. But the Photian schism really is. I think the material was there for the Greek and Latin schism. It was successfully healed in 879, 880, and so that's we're just flipping the page now in the story after that.
So when does he I was just trying to look up when he writes his long treatise against the Filioque. Is it before 879?
Oh, well, he wrote two things. He wrote,
Mystagogy?
the Mystagogy. He probably wrote that 10 years after 879. That's one of his late writings.
Okay. Well, because that's yeah.
Some scholars have suggested that it's actually a compilation of writings, and Photius was one of the editors. I know that Kebulba, she wrote the Reinventing or Inventing Latin Heresies.
Yeah,
she's got a weird thesis on that. I mean, no offense to her, she's brilliant. But I think, he wrote that, I think, from his pen, and it was later. In 867, he wrote his long encyclical condemning the Filioque, but that's not the Mystagogy.
Okay. Yeah, so Photian Schism arises. Now, we want to try to get to the Florentines. I want to touch on divorce and remarriage that pops up in the next century. And then we have Michael Carolarius in 1054. Then we have the Crusades. Then we have Lyons. Then we have Florence. So
yeah, we could breeze through that.
it's kind of like, I think what you said there, I think that's definitely true. I think all the materials there, and then there's just, I see the period between 879 to 1453, fall of Constantinople, really as that material just sort of gaining momentum as things progress, and the party against union with Rome just gains more power, more and more power, more and more influence. Less and less of the Unionists are in Constantinople. More bad blood is spilled, fratricidal blood, and eventually the final split arises somewhere later. So, but let's touch on divorce and remarriage. So what happens in the 900s, and how do you see the origin? Because so one of the things that the Roman Catholic, and you have a great article in your, by the way, if anybody has any questions, I hope we can get to some questions, but if you have any questions about any particular points, what I would suggest is going to erickybarra.org and searching any of those points, because Erick has articles on most of these issues that he goes into all the scholars and he looks into what the Eastern Orthodox say. He's very good. So take a look at that. But so one of your articles is about divorce and remarriage, and you basically argue that neither the East nor the West is fully holding to what the fathers say about divorce and remarriage, but that Rome is sort of closer, basically. Can you flesh out more what happens in 900s? How do we get the origin of the Eastern Orthodox 4 marriages rule?
Yeah, so this goes back to this issue of the canons, the canonical, the collections, or in Latin, the collectios. You don't have any legislation on divorce and remarriage in the early collections of canon law for the church, which is quite shocking. Meyendorff and Clarence Gallagher, Clarence Gallagher is a well-known Jesuit scholar on Byzantine and Latin canon law. Both of them think that because there was no resistance to imperial policy, which allowed for divorce, that somehow was acceptance. I don't think that follows. You really start to see the Emperor Justinian. Really, you see with Emperor Constantine, you start to see laws allowing divorce in certain circumstances. Roman policy, the Roman unbelieving Roman policy was marriage was based on mutual consent, divorce is based on mutual consent, no big deal. But Constantine, being the Christian emperor, he starts to really, put some laws in place. But he doesn't outlaw divorce. There's some conditions for it. And then with Justinian, the great jurist and emperor and all other things he was, when he codified certain, laws into his corpus, he allowed divorce on a number of conditions. I want to say it's like 10 different conditions for divorce. And then there was 2, I believe, for remarriage. Now, this is the difference between Eastern and Western canon law. John Scholasticus, his 50 titles collection started to include Imperial Constitutions, which really tells you where the Byzantine Church was. It was really right there next to the throne of the emperor. And in the West, you didn't have that, especially with Leo III and the Carolingian Revolution. Charlemagne gets a fresh collection of the Dionysiana Hadriana from Pope Hadrian the First. And of course, the Carolingians reform divorce and completely outlaw remarriage. You had certain Western synods that were allowing remarriage, especially in Britain with the penitentials of Saint Theodore of Tarsus. He was originally an Easterner. Now, there's been some debate on whether those are really from his pen. Those penitentials could be a pseudo author, but nevertheless, you see the papacy really coming down on never allowing remarriage for a fully consummated marriage, even in the case of adultery. And then you could trace that back to Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, and several other fathers. But in the East, you got a squirrely event going on with imperial constitutions coming into canon law. And in the 9th century, you have 2 laws from Justinian's novellas, 22 and 117. If any of your listeners want to go look that up, there's an English version. You could look up Justinian's novella there. His canons allowing remarriage get into the nomocanon of 14 titles. That's the Greek child of John Scholasticus's 50 titles. So you already have a remarriage policy, at this point, based on adultery. Of course, there was some other conditions as well. There is going against the emperor, planning an assassin, planning to kill your husband. These things. If the wife is caught doing these things, you could divorce her, and then you can get remarried.
And I want to point out, there are, even in the Western moral theology later, there are allowances for an imperfect divorce, which is a separation, but there's never really an allowance for a actual remarriage.
Right.
So
separation of bed and board is what they eventually started to call it. Because you going back to the Gospels, Jesus does say in Matthew 19 that if anyone divorces his wife and marries another, except for porneia, adultery, or sexual misconduct, he commits adultery. So that exception clause there was known by the fathers, where they accepted a technical divorce, a separation of bed and board, but never a remarriage while that spouse is still living. It's not too easy to see that the East was always on board with that. But again, a lot of the defenses that come for remarriage from the Eastern fathers are an argument from silence. I mean, Basil's canons start to get into Eastern canon law, in particular, some of his letters on this issue, and so the Council of Trullo in 692, you see a canon. I want to say it's 37. No, it's not 37. I forget which one it is, but there's a canon in Trullo where Basil's canon, which allows a man to, it seems like it says he can remarry if his first wife commits adultery on him or deserts him, and he could submit to penance, and then he could return to the church. But it's not all that clear. It's a very debatable point. But even if that was the case, that canon only allows it in one condition. namely adultery. But what you start having in the imperial constitutions of canon law in the East is not just adultery, but other conditions. And so this certainly becomes a problem as, at the Council of Florence, for example, the Pope said, hey, you guys need to fix the issue with divorce. And it really wasn't a matter that the Pope decided to really deal with dogmatically, because the East sort of semi-agreed in the meeting with the Pope there, but basically said, yeah, we only allow divorces in just causes. And so the Pope decided not to make it a matter to make a canon specifically on Eastern praxis. And but certainly at the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church has nailed it down that marriage is indissoluble. Now, Eastern Orthodox theologians assert the indissolubility of marriage, but it's more of something that it's aimed for. It's something that is potentially ideal, but it's not a rigid reality that's legally binding. Where the origination of the 3 to 4 marriages, it really comes. I know for a fact Epiphanius and Jerome, and no, this was not Jerome. This was Epiphanius. You could marry again up to 4 times, but in his context, he was talking about if your spouse dies, you could marry again after your spouse dies, and if that spouse dies, you could marry again, but you can't marry past 4. But in the West, they didn't really take it like that. I mean, to be found in that kind of a predicament is near impossible. But I mean, if it does happen, there is no restriction. But the East had a restriction on that. So this is one of the reasons why you had the situation in the 9th century. So East takes up this allowance for divorce and remarriage, but many of the more stricter canons deal with adultery. They allow it in the case of adultery. But because these imperial constitutions get into canon law, more conditions are allowed for divorce, and obviously then for remarriage. So that's how the East really got into allowing remarriage, divorce and remarriage, was the imperial constitutions. Now, some would argue, the Orthodox would argue that, well, no, it was in the Eastern Fathers. We have evidence from Basil, we have evidence from Epiphanius, we have evidence from Cyril and St. John Chrysostom that divorce should happen in the case of a wife committing adultery. It's not all that clear that they say that it's something beyond separation of bed and board, which is why I say it's more of an argument from silence. But some of these fathers do sort of speak to it. It sounds like they say that in the case of adultery, the husband anyway, not the wife, the husband can remarry. So, to this day, I've talked to clergy in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they admit that the canons are not really being followed, strictly. But at the same time, like I said in my article, the annulment procedure that we do in the Catholic Church today, and the economia practice of remarriage in the East, we're both at variance with the earliest church fathers. There's just no way that Augustine would tolerate if he's invited to a wedding at a Catholic parish in 2012, and then 2 years later they get divorced, and the tribunal says, well, because of the vast complexity of the human psyche, you weren't ready, you weren't prepared, and you get an annulment. Augustine would tear his hair out of his head, So we're both at variance. So I do want to say that it's not fair for Catholics to sort of berate the Orthodox because of they have liberalized. Let's just admit it. Okay, they've changed. They've liberalized. The imperial constitutions definitely influenced and opened up the gap. It used to be just adultery for the male. Then it turned into the wife could remarry and different conditions. So they are definitely at far variance with the Church Fathers. But it's, the Catholic annulment process, I think, is I think we are at odds as well. But I think on paper we've kept the closest to what the doctrinal insistence was, which is that the union is indissoluble until death, and even in the case of adultery, there's no green light to remarry. And several studies have been done to verify that. And you even have, like I said, you even have Orthodox clergy, bishops today, that will tell you that it's only in the case of adultery. But of course, what happens on a day-to-day basis in the Orthodox Church, as many of your listeners who are Orthodox might know, they definitely open up a variety of reasons to allow remarriage. Now, it's hard to get remarried in the Orthodox Church. That should be stated. It's not always easy. I know in certain situations, like in Greece, they sort of have to follow and abide by the state. When the state, I hear this anyway. I haven't verified it, but I hear in Greece that it's a little easier to get divorced. But generally speaking, from what I hear from my friends who are Orthodox and from the clergy, they do somewhat of a good job in making sure that people aren't just flippantly getting remarried, which may serve as a contrast with how easy it is to get an annulment in the Catholic Church.
Absolutely.
But on a doctrinal basis, I think that we're lockstep, with Augustine, the great Augustine, and definitely the majority of the Church Fathers.
Yeah, there is the doctrine on paper is that a consummated valid marriage can never be dissolved except by death, period. But because of the abuse, the annulment process, and all this other thing, for listeners, an annulment can only be as if you, for example, baptized with something other than water. It wasn't a real baptism. In the same way, if you celebrated a marriage without the proper matter and form, it didn't actually occur. That is what an annulment is just declaring the nullity of a sacrament. But that is a very important issue, which we have covered on this channel, is the annulment crisis that's been going on. But let's get back to the Greek schism, if we can. There's so much more to say, but the big points here are Michael Corellius in 1054, and we have the Crusades, which increases the fratricidal blood. We have the massacre of Latins by the Roman Empire in Constantinople in 1188. We then have the Sack of Constantinople in 1204 by the Latins. And then we have the failed reunion council of Lyon, 1274. And then we later have the Council of Florence, which is somewhat a failure as well, but somewhat a success in other areas. But so how would you describe this period? What are the main points to bring up here in the development of the Greek schism?
Yeah, ironically enough, I don't have much to say about Corellius and Humbert because historically speaking, it was just that insignificant. It carried, later on, it became a symbol for greater than what it was. But at the time, you had a letter from a certain bishop, Leo of Ohrid, Archbishop in the East, wrote a letter condemning the use of unleavened bread, condemning the filioque, condemning other liturgical practices, and basically saying that the West has turned to the error of the Judaizer. And Cardinal Humbert, who was in the southern peninsula of Italy, picked up on this and informed Pope Leo IX. Pope Leo IX writes a letter, sends Humbert and a couple others to Constantinople, and at this point they're not aware that there's this massive bomb ready to go off between the whole church in the East and the whole church in the West. They are cognizant of their differences. There's no doubt about that. Photius knew that the filioque was still being taught in the West, but Michael Carolarius gives a hard time to Cardinal Humbert and the other papal legates in terms of being cordial, and makes a delay on giving them a hearing. But while Humbert was there, he observed a number of things, and some of this is embarrassing. They took the filioque out of the creed. They have married priests. Their priests have beards. They should be shaven. So Cardinal Humbert is he's just as they say, a junkyard bully when it comes to these things. But so he ends up writing up a bull of excommunication, which was already prepared by Leo IX in case things went south. And without being able to talk to Michael Carolarius face to face, he went into Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, and right in the middle of liturgy, put a bull of excommunication on the altar. And and as they left, Michael Carolarius returned the favor. So that was a huge split, and the issue was filioque, unleavened bread. Those are the two principal issues. The other stuff was, the Greeks made a big deal out of these things. Latins did too, but it really was the unleavened bread and the filioque situation. And but Michael Carolarius made a detail that he wasn't excommunicating the Pope. He was excommunicating Cardinal Humbert and the legates. And so this was a split between the two individuals, but it became symbolic because, like we said before, the basic material that original, when form was added to the material later, the material has always been the same. Filioque, unleavened bread, papacy, and some of these other Trulin liturgical issues. We move forward in history now. It kind of goes into a blackout because politically speaking, the West is preoccupied. Pope Leo passes away, so that excommunication of Michael Carolarius is questionable. I am of the small opinion that it was effective. I have a few scholars that agree with me. Some people say that, well, the Pope died, so everything was shelved. No, I don't know about that. So, but we do know that the Patriarch of Antioch was not on board with Carolarius in terms of removing the Pope's name from the diptychs. Now, in Constantinople, the Pope's name was not on the diptychs even before Humbert got there, which is interesting. That goes back to 1009 when news came to Constantinople about the filioque in the West. But you have the Patriarch Peter of Antioch writing a letter to Carolarius saying that we should not remove the Pope from the diptychs, but he does complain about the filioque and the unleavened bread. So you don't have as the Greeks said, the Greeks they understood that the separation from Rome was not done like Nestorius. It was not done like Eutychius, where a council got together, they announced the heresies of the West, and laid the boom on the West. They never did that. It was a slow process of the Pope getting off the diptychs in the East. Not all the patriarchs did that. Happened in Constantinople first. Soon after, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem followed. But even after that, you still have the famous canon commentators like Balsamon, Zonaras, and then later Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. Balsamon is clear. The Latins are heretics. They're out of the church. But you had contemporaries to Balsamon that said, no, they're not out of the church. They're mistaken. And, they're barbaric, they're Latins. So you don't really have, it's not everybody's on board with this. It's sort of still a conversation at table almost. But when you get to the 13th century with the Crusades, following the Crusades, obviously the Crusades, today, especially hard Greek nationalists, they really heaped this up on the Latins with the Crusades. When St. John Paul II visited Athens, you had Greek monks out there with a sign that said, 1204.
Right. And there's a point here I want to make with this, is that do you ever see English Catholics or French Catholics hating each other because the English Catholics killed St. Joan of Arc in the 100 Years' War? You just don't have that same animosity. I mean, there's tons of Latins killing each other. I mean, there's tons of kingdoms. I mean, it's 100 Years' War for a reason. They call it that for 100 years, and they killed Joan of Arc and everything. But you just don't have that animosity that gets built. But you do have the animosity that happens in the East. And I'm not excusing it. All this fresh vital blood is a terrible offense to God. But there's just not the same animosity that gets built. I think that the biggest influence of the Crusades on the Greek Schism is a failure of a political alliance, which was in theory the sort of goal of the Crusades, in theory, because it was started by a cry for reinforcements, basically. So in theory, they could have united against the Mohammedans, and if they would have united against the Mohammedans, I think the Greek Schism would not have been happening. But they did not. They ended up killing each other or vying for each other's power, both the Latins among themselves and the Greeks and Latins. And so when you get to 1274 and the first reunion council attempt, it is a failure. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, definitely the sack of Constantinople did not help. Of course, not many people bring up the slaughter of the Latins in Constantinople, which happened 24 or so years before, in 1182. Many Latins were killed and exiled from Constantinople. Venetians, and especially those from Venice, Genoese, I believe. I might be mistaken on the Genoese part, but you have the sack of Constantinople, which is not ordered by the Pope. Okay. In fact, the Pope threatened excommunication to any of those armies attacking Christian cities. But as everybody knows, and if you want to read more on this, I really recommend Thomas Madden on the sack of 1204. It's really an unforeseen, unfortunate set of circumstances, and I think that English scholars like Steve Runciman, who comes sharply in defense of the Byzantine side, are not careful to note, and Madden does the best with that. So if readers want to do more research on 1204, the sack of 1204 really put the schism in the hearts and minds of the grandmas and the teenagers and the wives in Constantinople. It was no longer, the filioque and the bread, and they don't get it. They're using unleavened bread, and those silly barbaric Latins, and we should just love them and consider them as younger brothers in the faith. No, that was no longer said at the dinner table after 1204. But and then you had the Latin occupation of Constantinople. So, they set up an archbishop in Constantinople who was a Latin, and you had the Council of Lateran 1215, which, went along with this. The popes were very upset about the sack, but they kind of saw it as accidental providence, and they kind of went along with it. So, but, you get the Paleologos is coming in. He marches back, Michael VIII. He marches into Constantinople in 1261, I want to say. So 1204 to 1261, you have Latins taking, kind of occupying the city. And they're not just like, running the show. They're trying to take care of the Greeks. They're trying to do their best. But Michael VIII comes in and sort of takes the city back. And it's almost given to him. There's not too much of a debate about it. And Michael VIII, continuing with this, the dynasty that it would become, the Paleologuses, he wants to unite the churches. So this is where Pope Gregory X and Michael VIII get together, and they call the Council of Lyon in 1274. But the problem is Michael VIII really couldn't get the higher clergy to cooperate because they were still steamed about 1204, the Filioque, the Creed, the unleavened bread, milk and cheese during Lent, all this other stuff. But really the sack, but Michael VIII wanted to move past that, in order to really defend Constantinople and to make it healthy, we need union with Rome. So he gets a bunch of novice bishops, that are ready to do anything, the go-getters, and some imperial delegates to go to Lyon. And in 1274, they are okay with the Creed, they're okay with the Papacy, they're okay with everything, and so that council was sealed. It's an official council in the Latin West, but it's not really built off of a strong Greek enforcement. The higher clergy were really not into it. So when this council was repudiated, but what you have is another faction in Constantinople of the Unionist Party and the anti-Unionist Party, and then you had a couple moderate parties. But you had Unionist parties that defended that union. They defended the Filioque. They were accommodating Latin thinking, Latin etymology. They were willing to work with it. But you've got Gregory of Cyprus, who responds to John Bekos and basically says, no, we're not going to do this. So the anti-Unionist Party was able to assemble a council in 1285, Council of Constantinople, Blackernay, 1285, where they basically said, look, this eternal procession from the Spirit is according to this shining forth through the sun. It's got nothing to do with hypostatic origin, and the Latins are heretics. So that council really didn't work, and even in the Latin West, they didn't really. They recognized that the East was not on board with it. So that leads to other reunion attempts at the Council of Florence in the 15th century. Once again, you've got John VIII, Paleologus, who needs the military assistance of the Pope because the Turkish Muslims are ready to come to Constantinople. So Pope Eugene IV, calls a council in Ferrara, and it's later moved to Florence. And the Greeks and the Latins met together, and it's got to be one of the most intense back and forths that ever took place between Greeks and Latins. And you finally had a union signature. You had a couple of Greek clergy, higher clergy, like Isidore of Kiev, and who is the other guy of Nicaea, Archbishop of Nicaea. I can't remember his name. Oh boy, it'll come back.
It'll
come back. Yeah,
like Bessarion. Okay, yeah.
Right. He came to the council with his shield and sword out. He was against the Filioque. He was against the use of unleavened bread and all that. Interestingly enough, the papacy wasn't that much of a concern. The issue was the Filioque, and so you had a couple of high clergy that were won over to the Catholic arguments through the patristics. But you had Mark of Ephesus, whose voice was very important in the East, and he kept his finger on the Council of 879 in Constantinople, this is a tense topic for Catholic canonists today, because we didn't number that one ecumenical. after a number of years. And Mark of Ephesus was keen to point out that a pope really did ratify it. John VIII ratified it, and it disallowed any additions to the creed. But that's why this is why it reaches the head point about the papacy, because ever since Aquinas, the argument was that the Pope has the same authority as an ecumenical council, so he can add to the creed. But, Mark of Ephesus is still working with the idea that popes can't go against disciplinary canons. So Mark of Ephesus didn't go along with Florence, but they signed all the Greek delegates signed. It's said that the Patriarch of Constantinople signed. And before he died, he sort of said he went along with it, but scholars today argue that that's a spurious, it was a forgery, and so, but nevertheless, the Eastern bishops went back to Constantinople after signing agreement with the council, but the clergy in the East felt betrayed. They felt betrayed, but Emperor John VIII was not going to let this go to waste. So he upheld Florence. The next emperor upheld it. The next Patriarch of Constantinople upheld it. So it was upheld with great difficulty, but finally it was repudiated. Just before, they gave the throne to Gennadius Scalaris, right, the second, and he repudiated Florence, and then 1453 you've got the fall under the Turks, and since then the Greeks have developed a lot of anti-Latin animosity because a lot of them feel as though the tamperings that they did with the Latins at Lyon and Florence are is like a divine chastisement. This is one of the reasons why you have Greek nationalists today who, they still harbor some of these anti-Latin, feelings, but there's plenty to blame on the Greek emperors. I think that throughout this whole time, throughout the Crusades, beginning with Pope Urban II, you have nothing but the popes trying to make union with the Greeks, trying to send military help out there, trying to give spiritual motivation to defend the Holy Jerusalem city, but it is what it is. It's unfortunate.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. This definitely blame on both sides, and we don't. If the insertion of the filioque happened when the Pope was allying with the Emperor of the West in order to cleanse the Western Church of all this filth and the so-called pornocracy and enact the Cluniac reform. So they were trying to deal with all these Western problems, and the Western emperors did the filioque had been since Charlemagne or whatever. So there's certainly an unfortunate thing as well, because that is one of the causal factors at play here. But also ultimately it just always comes back to the papacy as the ultimate where the buck stops. So let's see. I've got here's a question from Emil. At what point did the consecration of bishops require permission by the Pope? That's a good question, because the bishops were locally elected and consecrated locally for centuries.
Yeah. So this is, this is something that's current praxis. Bishops are ordained under papal mandate, right? That's what has to happen today. In the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century, you did not have anybody, getting papal mandates for this stuff. I don't remember exactly which pope it was, but eventually, and this, so this here I'm going off of my vague memory. So let me preface my answer with that to Emil. I know Emil; he's a good guy. Eventually, national localities took over episcopal elections, and this is one of the problems you have in the West. when the papacy gets independence from Byzantium, as Timothy was talking about Leo III, and then crowning, putting the crown on the Western emperor, and you've got the Carolingian Revolution, and it seems as though the papacy is kind of free from the shackles, but the papacy would get back in the shackles because the Western emperors began to want to take over the papal throne, and so eventually, when you have a much more decentralized West, local kings and local secular magistrates take over the church and feel as though they can elect their own bishops and do all this kind of thing. Well, in order to circumvent this this secular takeover of decentralized churches, the papacy sort of made itself more authoritative and in the business of everybody's doing. And it really wasn't the Pope who wanted this. I just can't remember his name. It was the bishops who wanted to be ordained under papal permission. And in fact, that's what they wanted. They wanted to get away from the local dignitary who was trying to call shots. So Rome was seen, when in the West, the papacy rises to power in order to liberate the spiritual church in the West.
Right.
It's got nothing to do with the Pope wanting to, self-aggrandize. Now, granted, it sounds that way. If you read some of the decretals of St. Gregory VII and Pope Innocent III, obviously two champions of that time, it sounds as though they're thundering Peter and the keys and the rock and all this stuff. But really, what they're trying to do is they're trying to liberate. They're trying to breathe fresh air and give relief to many of the lay investiture problems that were going on in the West. So papal centralization really falls from that backdrop. If you want to get a really good overview of that, Emil, there's a book by Father Klaus Schatz. It's called Papal Primacy. It's from its origins to the present. And all you got to do is look in the table of contents. There's a whole chapter on this issue about when elections to the episcopate came under papal supervision. It's certainly not an apostolic discipline. The Pope, the popes never said it was. It is a disciplinary issue to meet the need at the time. If you ask me, we should roll it back today. I think we should, especially for the Eastern churches. The Eastern churches today are not, obviously they're not ordained by the Pope, but they do have to give a notice, a synodal notice that they were, ordained. But I think we could roll it back. I don't think Rome needs to have that much micromanagement now.
Yeah, sure. I got Alan Rule has a comment. If you read Pope John VIII's letter to Photius and Emperor Michael, he only accepts the council's decision to reinstate Photius. Read the two lessons carefully. They're both in Dvorak's book, The Photian Schism. So is it disputed whether or not John VIII actually accepted the anti-filioque clause? Is this a dispute here?
Well, there is a dispute. So if you read Dvorak's book, Dvorak translates one portion of the letter of John VIII after the council, which said that he accepts everything that was done at the council that was according to the instructions given to the legates. But it's very difficult to know what he meant by that, because he very clearly says that he accepts the council. And so, Dvorak makes the argument that he can't literally mean that he doesn't accept anything that didn't go according to his original instructions, because if that were the case, he'd accept nothing from the council. Which I think that's where Alan's coming from. He probably he probably thinks that, well, the only instruction given by John VIII was for the Pope to say, for Photius to say sorry, for Bulgarian mission to come back to Rome, and for Photius to be reinstated by an annulment of the deposition of 869. So that's all the Pope really gave. But at the same time, the legates, they had to modify that because there was information in Constantinople that the Pope didn't know about, and so they couldn't enforce the Pope's instructions en bloc. So there is a debate on what John VIII accepted from the council. I think it's safe to say that what he meant by that qualification, I only ratify what was done. Nothing that was done by the legates apart from the Pope's instructions. I think what he meant by that was that any decree at the council which somehow circumvents the privileges of Rome, he doesn't accept. But it's not clear. So I don't know if Alan wants to clarify what portion of the letters that he's talking about, because I've read Dvornik, and Dvornik very much stands with what I'm saying about the council.
Okay, well, Alan, if you want to chime in there, I want to get one last question out, and we got to kind of wrap up. My friend Curtis says, I have a question concerning the Maronites. Do we know what the neighboring Orthodox thought of them? Why didn't they join the schism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not versed on that. When I studied the Maronites, with John Moron and some of the claims that early Maronite history that supported the papacy, I was hit in the head by my Syriac Orthodox friend about how unreliable the origins of the Maronite Church are in the historiography. So now, ever since then, I just have not read anymore because I don't know what sources to really trust on the Maronite origin. In Lebanon, how did the Orthodox there respond to it? Well, of course they saw them as betrayers. They were actually they weren't betrayers, but they saw them as heretics and schismatics because they were in communion with the Filioquists and the Latins. But they certainly don't carry the stigma that the Eastern Catholic churches have, in Ukraine and the Ruthenian churches and the Eastern, they call it, pardon me, but the Uniate churches. They definitely don't carry that stigma where the Orthodox feel offended by that, because we know the Maronites go far back beyond.
Yeah, right on. That is an issue that we're going to take up in part 3. We're going to have we're going to have a Byzantine Catholic with us talking about what happens next in this saga up to the present, which is talking about the Eastern Catholic churches and the continued history of the Greek churches out of communion with Rome. And Alan Rule points out, and we don't have time to really get into this, but he says letters are found on page 206 and 209, and that's in the Photian Schism by Francis Dvornik, if anybody wants to look into that a little bit more. I know that's a hefty volume. It's about 500 pages with a lot of research. But it's a great work. So Erick, thanks so much for coming on. Any final thoughts you want to share on this important topic?
No, I have a book that's, coming near to completion on the papacy and the Orthodox. It's a lot of people come to me for this topic, but I'm ready to move on. This book, I consider it kind of like my last testament on this issue, and anything going forward, I would just direct people to it. So look forward to that. And, I'm a regular host on Reason and Theology. We got some good stuff coming up. And I really appreciate you, Tim, for, we go way back. Tim and I go way back. I'm no stranger here. I'm new to the show though. But I appreciate you having me on.
Oh yeah, always good to talk with you, brother. So let's pray for the East and the West. Let's pray for our brethren who find themselves in the schism. I think most Greek schismatics are not really schismatic. I think it's mainly Soloviev makes the claim that most Russians are just pious Christians. They're not concerned about all these controversies, and it's really the higher clergy who are leading the charge towards schism. So we're going to pray in Our Father for the end of schism, because schism is a sin against charity. Ultimately, it's a failure to love one's brother in Christ and to affect that unity by this charity. So let's pray for that. Again, our special intention is for children who have left the faith. So let's pray for them. So we'll offer this up for them and all our intentions. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son,